recently wrote a book on something which is pretty much on target to what we are discussing today. Your book it's latest book, I think, it's the latest one you wrote. It's Dangerous to Believe. Mary's been a very successful author. She was a senior researcher at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and she's highly qualified to talk about this topic. And please tell us what you think about this topic, maybe in light of your recent research.
Thank you. Thank you, Fulvio. I'm going to give a kind of big picture version of this. It's very difficult to follow Rocco Bottiglione, but I will do my best. I have no dramatic stories or very funny ones, but I would like to share how I got interested in this subject. It happened very accidentally. Several years ago, a barrister from England knocked on my door in Washington, D.C. His name is Paul Diamond, and he works with a small shop called Christian Concern that some of you may have heard of. Paul is the top barrister in England for religious liberty cases, and he wanted to tell me what was happening there because, he thought that Americans were not nearly as attentive as they ought to be to what was happening on the other side of the pond. And he had a string of stories, some of which you may have heard of. For example, the British Airways employee who was made to take off a crucifix while in uniform, even though other kinds of religious expression were allowed. There were a lot of other cases. The delivery driver who was fired for leaving a crucifix on the dashboard of his van. The street preacher jailed for reading aloud from the book of Leviticus on the street. That case was particularly interesting because the judge in the case actually went through some lines in Leviticus and told the preacher which ones he could have read aloud without being thrown in jail and which ones he couldn't. So on and on it went. And as alarmed as I was for England, I couldn't help thinking inside, well, but that's England. They don't have a constitution. They don't have a First Amendment. This kind of thing could never happen here. So fast forward a few years. We all know the headline cases of religious liberty, but there are lots of other ones too. And in addition to the legal cases, which are really just the tip of all of this, there are the examples of social ostracism and the examples of perhaps opportunities deprived to particularly tradition-minded Christians. Are Christians from homeschooled families treated fairly at levels of elite education admittance, for example? So I started compiling anecdotes across the sort of cultural, historical, political, legal realms. And the result was a short manifesto that appeared earlier this year called It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies. And I want to hold it up not for purposes of promotion, actually, but so that you can see the cover, which is of a place where a cross once stood and has been taken down, which I think summarizes the argument better than I can do in a few words here. So this book appeared in the spring, and it takes an unusual tack. It is an invitation to secularists and progressives to engage the argument of the book. It says, look, your movement has gone off the rails. You are not walking in the footsteps of Martin Luther King Jr. or progressives like Christopher Lasch or Harry Truman. Your movement has taken a turn into a kind of rival secularist religion that is now demanding of traditional religious believers that they absent themselves from the public square. There is an entire chapter in the book, just to give one concrete example, about efforts to shut down homeschooling in the United States and about attacks on Christian universities. In the last 10 years, for instance, there have been attacks on the accreditation of two flagship Protestant universities, Gordon College in Massachusetts and the King's College in New York, both instigated by, I wouldn't even say liberal ideology, because this is not yesterday's liberalism, instigated by secularist, progressive desire to wipe the public square free of Christianity. Now, in both of those cases, failure was the result, but I see them as obviously just the beginning of a more concerted assault on Christian higher education. So there are all kinds of attacks out there that I think the recent election may shed a little more light on. It turns out that I wasn't the only one noticing that a lot of the country has been ideologically under siege. And also, I think it's very important to get at the effect of all of this on Christian charities, which are also the objects of all kinds of legal and other attack these days. And I think the time really has come to turn the moral tables around on this and to say to the other side, where are your standards of diversity? Where are your standards of tolerance? Who goes around trying to shut down adoption agencies, emergency pregnancy centers, and other organizations that try to help poor people? Who does that? I think rhetorically and otherwise, we can be very effective making that case because it does turn out that the left is not a monolith in all of this. I think there are reasonable people who can be reached. And again, the results in November, whatever else they mean, certainly mean that a lot of people in the country are tired of having their religiosity mocked and tired of being treated like second-class citizens and haters when they are not haters and bigots at all. So that's how my interest and attention was brought to this subject. And I hope that by putting it out there in public in this way, we can engage other people, hopefully reasonable people, to get back to a more normal kind of consensus about these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. It's interesting for people who are more familiar with political theory, the way in which in the past many liberals promoted laws like related to abortion in Europe or here, or also related to marriage, is the idea that democracy is a neutral zone for values. So we should just create more options to people. So these laws don't deny freedom, they just increase freedom. And so neutrality has been the dogma of this kind of political theory, neutral liberalism. Now it's interesting that we are facing a sort of moment in which truth is emerging. I mean, there is no neutrality in democracy. So either you accept that you are promoting some values and these values conflict with other values, or you are just lying because there is no neutral zone. Either you go one direction or go the other direction. And we are reaching a point in which we are raising conflicts with many people. And now, unfortunately, many Christians are the weak side of this conflict right now. So that's why it's so urgent to talk about these things.